The cold metal walls pulsed faintly with a low hum, a constant reminder of the Vorak's superior technology. Elara Voss hit the ground hard as the guards shoved her into the cell, the force knocking the breath out of her. She winced, catching herself with her palms against the icy floor. Behind her, the heavy door slid shut, sealing with a hiss. One of the guards sneered, his voice reverberating through the cell. "Let's see how long the little human lasts with the Lykanthar." Laughter echoed before their footsteps faded into silence. Elara's heart pounded as she pushed herself upright, scanning her surroundings. The cell was dimly lit, shadows pooling in the corners, but her attention snapped to a sound, a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down her spine. She squinted, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. A massive figure loomed in the far corner, barely visible in the faint light. It shifted, and the dim glow caught the glint of sharp teeth and glowing yellow eyes. The creature was enormous, its wolf-like form bound by thick, alien restraints. Chains anchored it to the floor, but its sheer size and the predatory way it moved made it clear this wasn't just some captured beast. Elara's instincts screamed at her to stay back, but her training as a medic took over. Her gaze swept over the creature, noticing the blood dripping from deep gashes along its flank. Despite its fearsome appearance, it was injured, badly. The Lykanthar lunged forward suddenly, the chain stopping it just short of her. She flinched, her body reacting before her mind caught up, but the creature didn't attack. It let out a snarl, the sound echoing in the small space. She forced herself to breathe, her voice steady as she spoke. "You're hurt." The Lycanthar's growl deepened, its yellow eyes narrowing. Elara crouched slowly, making herself as non-threatening as possible. "I don't know if you can understand me," she said, her voice calm and deliberate. "But if I don't help you, you're going to die. And I don't plan on dying in here with you." The creature's gaze was sharp, intelligent even. It didn't lunge again, but it didn't relax either. Blood continued to pool beneath it, the dark liquid contrasting starkly with the pale floor. Her mind raced. The Vorak had thrown her in here to die, to be torn apart by their deadliest wolf. But they hadn't accounted for one thing. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a medic. And medics didn't leave anyone behind, no matter how terrifying. Elara reached for the thin strip of fabric around her wrist, a band she'd worn to secure her hair during long shifts. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She tore it into smaller strips, her fingers working quickly and efficiently. "I'm going to help you," she said, her voice firm. "Even if you don't like it." The Lycanthar's growl softened slightly, more a rumble of warning than outright aggression. Elara took it as a sign. Carefully, she edged closer, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. The alien predator watched her, unblinking, as she approached. It shifted slightly, its muscles tense, but it didn't move to stop her. Elara knelt beside the injured creature, her pulse racing. "You're going to have to trust me," she murmured, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to the Lykanthar or herself. Elara sat cross-legged on the cold floor, keeping her movements deliberate as she tore her jumpsuit into strips. Her mind worked in overdrive, cataloging everything in the cell that could serve a purpose. The glowing moss clinging to the cracks in the walls emitted a faint warmth, likely carrying some kind of chemical property. The condensation on the ceiling dripped steadily, pooling near the edges of the floor. The Lykanthar, still chained, watched her with wary eyes, its breathing shallow. Its wounds were deep, and she knew infection would set in soon if left untreated. "I don't have much to work with," she muttered, mostly to herself. "But I've dealt with worse." She got to her feet slowly, her eyes scanning the cell again. The Vorak must have underestimated her, or thought her death was a foregone conclusion, because they hadn't stripped her of her belt. Attached to it was a small, retractable blade, designed for emergency situations. Sliding it free, she turned her attention to the glowing moss. She scraped off a small amount with the blade, inspecting its texture and scent. It had a sharp, acrid smell, one that hinted at antiseptic properties. She quickly gathered more, crushing it between her fingers until it formed a paste. The Lykanthar let out a low rumble, its massive head turning to follow her movements. She met its gaze, her voice steady. "I know you don't trust me. But if I don't clean those wounds, you're not going to make it." It bared its teeth, the growl deepening. She didn't flinch, holding its gaze. "Look, you don't want to die here, and I don't either. Let me help you." The growl softened, and after a moment, the creature shifted slightly, exposing its injured side. Elara didn't waste the opportunity. She knelt beside it, keeping one eye on its claws and teeth as she worked. Using the moss paste, she cleaned the deepest gash on its flank. The creature tensed, a low growl vibrating through its chest, but it didn't strike her. "I know it stings," she murmured. "But it's better than losing the limb." She worked quickly, using the strips of fabric to bind the wound tightly. Her hands moved with practiced precision, years of battlefield experience kicking in. The Lycanthar's breathing slowed slightly as she continued, its massive body no longer trembling with pain. As she tied off the final bandage, she leaned back, exhaling. "There. It's not perfect, but it'll hold for now." The creature's yellow eyes met hers, something unreadable in its gaze. It didn't growl this time, and for a brief moment, it almost seemed curious. Elara sat against the wall, her legs trembling from the adrenaline. "You're smarter than they think," she said quietly, watching as the Lycanthar settled back into its corner. "But they don't know that, do they? Just like they don't know what humans are capable of." The creature huffed softly, its gaze steady. Elara smiled faintly, exhaustion tugging at her. "We're going to get out of here," she whispered. "Both of us. You'll see." Elara woke to the faint sound of the Lycanthar's chains rattling. It was moving again, testing its restraints, but its motions were deliberate rather than aggressive. She sat up slowly, her body stiff from exhaustion, and studied the creature. Kale, as she had decided to call it after noticing the alien glyphs etched into its collar, was no longer snarling at her every move. Instead, it seemed focused on something in the corner of the cell. Its claws scraped lightly at the base of the wall, where a faint crack in the alloy joined the floor. Curious, Elara crawled closer, keeping her movements slow. She pressed her hand to the floor near the crack, feeling a faint vibration. Her eyes narrowed. "That's not just structural," she murmured. "That's part of the energy field." Kale let out a low rumble, its sharp eyes meeting hers. It wasn't just reacting to the weak spot, it had noticed it, too. Elara's mind raced. The Vorak cells were designed to be impenetrable, but no system was perfect. If the energy field anchoring the structure could be disrupted, they might have a chance. But she'd need more than brute strength to make it work. Her hand brushed against her belt, where a small device was tucked into a hidden seam. A compact EMP unit, standard issue for medics operating in hostile zones. She'd barely remembered it was there, but now it felt like her lifeline. "You're stronger than me," she said, glancing at Kale. "But strength alone won't get us out. We're going to need to work together." Kale tilted its head slightly, the movement almost canine. It watched as Elara knelt by the crack, inspecting the structure more closely. The metal around the joint was thinner, likely reinforced by the energy field itself. She turned to Kale, holding up the EMP device. "This will take down the field, but only for a few seconds. Once it's down, you'll have to break through the wall. Do you understand?" Kale growled softly, its eyes narrowing. Elara sighed. "You don't have to like me, but if we want to survive, we need each other." The creature huffed, shifting its massive body closer to the crack. It stretched its claws forward, scratching at the weak spot again. Elara took it as a sign of agreement. With trembling hands, she activated the EMP, setting the timer for a short burst. She placed it near the crack, then backed away quickly. The device emitted a sharp, high-pitched whine before discharging, a ripple of energy coursing through the cell. The hum of the energy field cut out, leaving an eerie silence. Kale wasted no time. It lunged forward, its claws slashing at the weakened metal. Sparks flew as it tore through the paneling, its growls echoing in the confined space. Elara held her breath, her heart pounding as the creature's strength finally broke through. The hole it created was just large enough for them to crawl through, leading into a dark corridor beyond. "Good work," she whispered, her voice shaking with relief. "Now let's get out of here." Kale turned to her, its yellow eyes sharp and calculating. Then, with a low rumble, it stepped into the corridor, its massive form disappearing into the shadows. Elara followed close behind, adrenaline propelling her forward. The corridor stretched ahead, dimly lit by flickering lights that sputtered with the same unstable energy she'd disrupted in the cell. Elara followed Kale closely, her eyes darting to every shadow. The Vorak wouldn't ignore the breach for long, and their response would be brutal. Kale moved with an eerie grace despite its size, its claws clicking softly against the metallic floor. Its ears twitched at every distant noise, its yellow eyes scanning the path ahead. Elara couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. The creature wasn't just surviving, it was strategizing. They didn't get far before alarms blared, the sound shrill and deafening. Elara cursed under her breath, her hands tightening into fists. Kale growled low, its body tensing as the sound of heavy boots echoed down the corridor. The Vorak guards rounded the corner, their bulky forms silhouetted against the flashing red lights. They carried weapons designed to subdue and destroy, their dark eyes gleaming with cruel intent. Kale didn't hesitate. With a guttural snarl, it leapt forward, its chains rattling faintly as remnants of its restraints dragged behind it. The first guard didn't even have time to raise his weapon before Kale's claws slashed through his chest, sending him crumpling to the ground. Elara darted to the side, grabbing a fallen weapon from the floor. It was alien in design, but she'd seen enough Vorak technology to understand the basics. She adjusted the settings quickly, turning the weapon's power to its highest non-lethal output. As Kale tore into the second guard, Elara aimed at the third. She fired, the weapon recoiling in her hands as a pulse of energy struck the guard square in the chest. He collapsed, stunned but alive. "Keep moving," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Kale snarled in response, dispatching the last guard with a swipe of its claws. Blood streaked its fur, but it didn't slow down. Together, they pressed forward, weaving through the labyrinth of corridors. They reached a larger chamber, a control room lined with consoles and flickering holographic displays. Elara's eyes immediately locked onto a central terminal, its interface glowing faintly. If they could override the ship systems, they might have a chance to escape. Kale growled, its gaze fixed on the door as more footsteps approached. "Hold them off," Elara called, running to the terminal. Her fingers flew over the controls, her heart racing as she worked to bypass the Vorak security protocols. The interface was alien but logical, and she quickly found a way to overload the ship's power grid. Kale roared, lunging at the reinforcements pouring through the doorway. Its movements were brutal and precise, each strike calculated to incapacitate or kill. Despite its injuries, it fought like a creature possessed, its massive frame holding the line. Elara gritted her teeth as the terminal fought her efforts to disable the ship's defenses. The Vorak weren't making it easy, but she refused to give up. "Come on," she muttered, sweat dripping down her temple. A booming voice echoed from the corridor, cutting through the din. The Vorak commander stepped into view, his armor gleaming under the harsh lights. He sneered at the scene before him, his weapon aimed directly at Elara. "You think a human and a beast can outwit us?" he taunted, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're nothing more than a fragile nuisance." Elara didn't look up, her hands still working the terminal. "You made a mistake," she said, her voice steady. "You underestimated us." Kale lunged at the commander, its roar deafening. The Vorak fired, but the shot went wide as the Lykanthar crashed into him, claws ripping through his armor. The commander's screams were brief, cut off as Kale finished him with brutal efficiency. Elara slammed her hand against the terminal, the final override triggering a cascade of sparks. The ship's alarms shifted to a higher pitch, signaling a critical failure. "That's it," she shouted. "The ship systems are overloading. We need to move." Kale turned to her, blood dripping from its claws, and gave a low huff. Together, they bolted from the control room, the walls trembling as explosions rippled through the ship. They reached an escape pod bay, the small vessels lined up and ready for launch. Elara scrambled into one, Kale squeezing in behind her despite its massive frame. She slammed the controls, sending the pod hurtling away from the doomed ship. As they drifted into the void of space, the Vorak cruiser erupted in a brilliant explosion, fragments scattering into the darkness. Elara slumped in her seat, her chest heaving as she stared at the destruction. Kale settled beside her, its breathing heavy but calm. For the first time, it didn't look like a predator. It looked free. Elara glanced at it, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Told you we'd make it." The Lykanthar huffed softly, its gaze steady. For a moment, they sat in silence, the stars stretching endlessly before them.